DD, I think. I'm not sure. Anyway, talking about clarifying document life cycles for encounter and patient summary documents. Joe, take it away. Do you want me to drive or rather you drive?
Let me drive. I'm gonna jump to the external document briefly. So I will share my desktop.
Look at that shaggy mane. You need a haircut there, Mr. Mane.
I wanted to announce my entry in the COVID hair contest.
I love it.
So there you go.
Top contender for sure.
Yeah. So what I want to talk about is we just concluded the third iteration of the Commonwealth Care Quality Joint Content Work Group, and this will be my third time presenting to this group on work done in that group. And what I've done is what's big at this point is that we've concluded work on the 2.0 version of the guide, and I actually have a link to that. It's still in kind of a draft form, but it's been reviewed by some of the appropriate committees that need to review it. So it's kind of a stopping point, and you are welcome to reference it. I want to point out that I edited the agenda, so there's now a link to the guide. You should be able to get to it if you want to follow along. And further, I tied the sections in the guide to my two topics. So what we're going to talk about today, I mean, the guide covers a lot of things. It covers the intersection of query and content. And so a lot of stuff has to do with like IAT, XDS mechanisms, and we're not going to talk about that. But there are other things that get into the actual content. And so that's what I'm going to bring and we're going to talk about today. So the two topics are, one is about encounter summaries and how you indicate that an encounter is done, and the use of legal authenticator. So I want to talk a little bit about that. We talk about that in section 352. And then with the patient summary, which we were just talking about 2 minutes ago, we have a section in the guide that talks about generating a current patient summary and how you populate the sections. There's a lot of confusion about this, and so we wrote down how it can be done, and we gave one example of how it is done by the VA, where you populate sections based on default time ranges, and where you populate sections based on query time ranges, meaning if someone asks for 5 years, do you give them a patient summary that includes things from 5 years? So let's jump in. Okay, move to, all right, I'm going to jump first to my slides. And let's move that over a little bit. All right. So one of the nice things about this group is that we had really good involvement by clinicians. We had like Dr. Stephen Lane, and we had Holly Miller, and then we had some real good subject matter experts like Emma was on, and Brett Marquardt, and lots of smart people. One of the things that the clinicians wanted to know was when an encounter is done, and so there was a lot of discussion about this, and well, in the bullets that I've got, an encounter can appear to be done if the document has an effective time high, right? So that the encounter is concluded in time. It also can look like it's done if it's got an authenticator, if it's got a legal authenticator. But we had examples where there might be two examples where it could change after that. One is where you're expecting content. So for example, you have outstanding lab results. And then the other is, as always is the case, unexpected corrections. And however that would come along, these would show up as new documents that would be related to the previous one by an append or replace relationship. And so that was kind of the overall question. Now, one of the things that I should point out about this is, although we heard it as a need from clinicians, we could have done a better job at finding out how critical a need it was. Like, was it just a desire, or was it a really hard need? Okay. At any rate, we're going to take it that it's pretty serious, but we didn't come up with an answer, so that's why we're here talking to you all. So talking about how Legal Authenticator is used, some systems use Legal Authenticator as the base CDA spec implies, which is kind of as an explicit final step where you're verifying the content, you're signing it off. CDA uses the term completing the document, moving it into a completed state. Now, as I mentioned on the previous slide, I think the big difference is that a CDA is the snapshot. It's not the encounter. It's a snapshot of the encounter. So the question is, can you indicate through a CDA the state of the underlying encounter, like as it lives in the EHR? So use of Legal Authenticator, what we found was, and it's probably not a surprise to you all, but it was to me, that some systems don't use Legal Authenticator in the explicit sign-off way at all. They do it kind of in reverse. It's a single configurable identity, which is implicitly applied to all generated documents. So they might put their HIM manager as this, and some vendors do that. And what that kind of means is that if you think of the point of Legal Authenticator, at least these are my words, and I'm going to ask you to correct me. The point seems to be that it is saying, we're really sure that this is the right content, and we're so sure that we're going to give our legal name to it. Okay, we're signing it, saying that this is accurate. So it's kind of a QA function, it seems like, and so with that idea, you could use it as, okay, I'm going to add the Legal Authenticator when I physically review it and sign it, or if I'm the HIM manager and I have procured a system, I've procured an EHR system that has lots of protection for preventing fat-fingered errors, and it's got all sorts of checks and things to make sure that every time somebody clicks on something or drags something or hits OK on something, that it's that I trust it. And so anytime I dynamically generate a document from that content, I can smack that with a Legal Authenticator with the name of the HIM manager, because the HIM manager is the person who is attesting that everything that led up to the generation of that document can be trusted. That's how I read that use of Legal Authenticator. So I'm going to stop and say, does that jive with your understanding of Legal Authenticator, those two uses? Don't all talk at once.
It feels stronger than I anticipated it to be.
Which use? Or are you saying just my interpretation?
Well, you know, that you're sure it's 100% accurate, and it, you know, I would say it's what I think of it is when the doctor looks at in a paper world, would look at the chart and say, yeah, that's what I want you to send out.
Right. Yeah, I don't mean 100% accurate, because you can Legal Authenticate a document and then later on correct it. So it's not that. It's I may have overstated it. But I guess what's key, there are a couple of things here, and that is there any guidance that we need to provide about Legal Authenticator use with these two very different uses of it that we're seeing in the wild? And secondarily, we'll return to the question of, what does the use of Legal Authenticator tell you about the state of the encounter as a whole? So let's start with the use of Legal Authenticator in this way. Is there any guidance that we need about this idea, this second bullet, of it just being an identity? Because one of the things we found problematic with it was that it was a configurable option, And unless you did this configuration with some vendors, you'd never get a legal authenticated document. And so you've got kind of, if you think about the error modes, the failure modes, in the first bullet, the failure mode is the physician forgets to ever get around to it. They don't set a reminder for themselves and they never sign off. And we heard pain points from people saying, we've got these, we know these particular physicians never sign off their documents. And then the pain point for the second bullet is if no one ever configures the system with this legal authenticator, so then you're not going to ever get a legal authenticator. So what we came away with it was, well, we can't use presence of legal authenticator to tell us anything really super meaningful about the state of an encounter. I see Rochelle nodding. So is that, does that match your interpretation?
So I'm happy to speak for Epic here. We are one of the vendors that has an implicitly configured legal authenticator. And the reason we did that is sort of from a workflow perspective. If one org requests a document from another and they just automatically generate that, then there's not really any spot in that workflow unless you want to hold up the document request for who knows how long for someone to go ahead and sign off on that document. So because of all the different use cases that can pop up while you're doing this, we sort of figured that having a single person to be the implicit legal authenticator was sort of the only approach that made sense for us to take here workflow-wise. And so I agree that, the downside to doing it this way is that the presence or absence of a legal authenticator doesn't really tell you much. But in so much as we're requiring or, strongly recommending or whatever legal authenticators to be present in the document, I think that at least for our use cases, implicitly having one there is sort of the only approach that really makes sense.
Okay.
From a patient portal perspective and receiving documents from other EHRs that maybe we're not creating their CCD, the sign off is the important part because that's how they get utilization. Was the document received timely from MIMP's perspective or for, old meaningful use perspective? If the document was received timely in the portal, then you get credit, but we don't care whether it was signed off on or not. It's up to the hospital. I mean, we care, but it's up to the hospital or the the ambulatory setting to determine what's considered okay to show the document in the portal. And then some systems actually release it after 24 hours, regardless of if it was signed off, and they have a rule with their physicians to let them know that that's what's happening. If you don't sign off your own document, it will go in the patient portal regardless of if you signed off or not. So that's kind of where we see this happening, but I can't say that's always are filled out for sure.
So Rochelle, does that break your use case, or can you meet it in some other way? If the legal authenticator is just always there by implicit,
No, it doesn't matter in the portal perspective or in the MIMPS perspective, because it's just that the patient received their documents timely. It has no implementation on if it was signed off of by the provider. The provider should have reviewed it, but it doesn't indicate anything related to, that it had a digital signature or a legal authenticator.
Okay. All right. So real quickly, is there any guidance that you think we should provide about legal authenticator, or is it good to go?
This will go back to my other comment about author, performer, custodian, legal authenticator. I mean, we need just a chart of all those possible persons that can go, or participants that can go into a CCD to be understood completely.
Okay.
Well, they are kind of fuzzy in a way. I mean, there is a chart, or it was a chart on roles,
Right.
Those participant roles in the volume 1, and how they behave. But,
right. Exactly.
So. I don't know that there's, I know they didn't finalize that legal authenticator was required because you wanted to be able to release a document for clinical care before it had been legally authenticated. But I think that's the only reason why it was not a required header line.
One thing that jumped out is that we were pretty treatment based. I mean, care quality and Commonweal are not limited to treatment, but the use cases we were talking through were treatment. And when I went digging, I found that, for example, in the attachments IG, they require that documents that are exchanged for payment purposes are all legally authenticated. And whereas when we discussed it in a treatment sense, not only did they reject the idea of that being a low bar, but they even rejected the idea that an encounter had to be done to be exchanged for treatment. In other words, there could be some cases where you could exchange an in-progress encounter because it's useful for treatment. And so we captured that, and we gave a lot of leeway about that, but we also left a note in there saying we should talk to structured documents and find out if they have anything more to say about this. Like,
well,
if
I think the reason it has to be signed on the payment is it's per their contract that they are legally attesting that they provided that care.
No, they're legally attesting that the document is correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
I mean, I think that, I don't know. I mean, I would hate to say, no, we don't need guidance if there's questions and problems, because that does indicate that we need guidance or that people aren't reading the implementation guide. So, I mean, if you've read the implementation guide, is there any more additional guidance that's needed other than what's in, say the US Realm header or in the participant chart that's in volume 1? Is there some specific places in there that we feel that there might be some additional guidance needed?
I think this is Emma, and I'm sorry, I had to leave and then come back. Because I know we create CDA documents for ambulatory care and inpatient settings. And different places, different organizations have different ways of determining what is considered an encounter is done. Some organizations, especially on the inpatient side, do not consider an encounter done until at least 30 days after that encounter, after the patient has been discharged. So we've heard in my personal opinion, from, working on different EHRs and stuff, when an encounter is considered done is really a local policy kind of thing. Some people doesn't consider it done until they feel all the billing stuff has been posted and all of that. Some places consider it done as soon as the patient is discharged or as soon as the patient leaves the building. So this is, the whole idea of done really needs to be defined as to, from a CDA perspective, from a document sharing of data, a sharing of document perspective, what is considered done versus from a workflow, from a organization perspective, what is considered done.
But if, in your examples, if this is Dr. Miller, if 6 weeks have gone by, so there's a hospital that has defined 6 weeks because their blood culture may take up to 6 weeks. So they've defined 6 weeks as the period of time that before a document can be considered done. And that patient shows up in an ED across the country, there has to be access to that information. So
no, and I'm not saying don't send out the document until the encounter is. This is what is, I think the definition that we will need as an implementer is, what do you define as an encounter is done? Really, for me to give guidance to say, You know, and I'm not saying that they don't let the encounter go, let the encounter out the door. I have us one there. We have some systems where they have a job that runs every night to pick up a CDA document at midnight to send it out if that record had been saved to the chart. So they will send the CDA document out with the information that's in it as of this point in time.
Mhm.
Whether the encounter is considered done or not done, you know what I'm saying?
So let's look at the ambulatory world where I really like the solution that Epic created because that allows the organization to configure
Mhm.
the legal representation to say it's done. Working at the Cleveland Clinic, I can tell you there were colleagues that I had that in fact, one colleague never, ever completed a note. Like they never signed off on the note. They just never, ever did. And so this solution that Epic has created allows for the completion of notes without breathing down on that clinician's neck every moment. And I think, I don't know that we can define done. I think
Yeah.
your point, it may be that the edge systems have solutions to define done, and we use those solutions.
And I'm agreeing. I think this is something that is configurable. I believe this is something that is driven by local policy. It's also something that's driven by the way in which providers practice. So yeah, I agree that it's for us to sit and draw a line in the sand will be difficult to do.
Yep, I completely agree.
So I'm actually glad that Dr. Miller, that you're on the call, actually, and Emma as well. We collected the question of when is an encounter done as a pain point, and I think what I'm hearing is that there would be different definitions of done for different use cases. Like when is it done for the purpose of saying that all the payment is done with it, which is different from when is it done enough to exchange for clinical use.
Yeah.
And it could be that I would turn that back around and say, okay, we started with the question of when is it done, but I would turn it around and say, okay, those of you clinicians who were offering that as a pain point, let's drill down and say, what kind of done would you like us to be able to answer? You know, because maybe we got it wrong by just capturing it as this pain point as when is an encounter done. You know, maybe we should have done a more detailed job about that. So, all right. So I do want to move to the next topic. But I guess what I'm going to
Joe,
take away.
I have a question for you on that. I'm interested, curious. I just looked at the encounter activity template, and it is a template that is silent on status code. And I'm just wondering if the folks from Epic considered including status code with any kind of value from the ACT status value set to semantically communicate if they think the encounter is completed or not. And did you guys look at that in your evaluation of how to describe this? Did anybody look at whether or not the encounter activity template should weigh in on the use of the status code?
Matt, you're on mute if you're talking.
Maybe he stepped out. Joe, do you know if the group looked at the template that's called encounter activity and whether or not they discussed if that template should be using the status code?
The C-CDA encounter template?
Activity, it's called encounter activity, yep.
Yeah, let me look. No, we didn't look at the status of it, and the reason was because it's a more direct thing is the effective time of an encounter. You know, they're both kind of the same. Well, they're related, I would say. If the encounter has an effective time high, well, then the things that were happening in that counter are done. Like it could be the time of discharge. But the use case we kept coming back to was you have labs that are outstanding and they come back after discharge. So it wasn't my understanding that you would update the encounter time, effective time high, to include when those labs were done. So I guess I would have thought that the status code, if we had talked about it, might pertain more to the clinical encounter and not to the information gathering after it.
I would have gone the other way.
Okay.
You know, if the patient had a 45-minute appointment, they're
Right.
in and they're out. I would think effective time low and effective time high would reflect how many minutes this encounter actually took up. And then the status code could indicate a machine state of completed or still active if for some reason there's a business rule that says, well, we keep this thing open for 30 days, and if you got your CDA document produced after those 30 days, then the status code would be completed, and if you got it before those 30 days, the status code would be active.
Right.
But the actual span of time that the encounter took up from when the patient's visit started to when the patient's visit was over, you know, I'm sure there's quality measures or even
There is quality
claim
measures.
things based on how many minutes did you see the patient for.
But
I think we're
encounter
saying the
versus
same thing,
patient visit, or I mean, encounter versus a patient visit in the EHR world for ambulatory are two different, both worlds are two different things. There's an encounter summary and there's a visit, you know, I mean, encounter ID and there's a visit ID. And when you're talking about quality measures, that gets very confusing because some things within the encounter can happen over days, like what was mentioned, whereas if it's happening during the visit, it's different.
Also, I wonder how accurate, you know, in an ambulatory setting, they're going to be capturing the minutes, you know.
And they don't, and I can tell you, they're not.
Yeah, I know. I think the minute encounter comes from sort of a subjective assessment when they're applying ICD-10 encounter codes that say blah 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 blah. You know, this
Right.
visit 30 minutes. This first visit 45 minutes.
Right.
Not
And just
real.
because you had a
Yeah.
15-minute visit doesn't mean you had a 15-minute encounter.
Right, and I can't even
Because that
imagine
stays
when I
open
see
when you go to
effective
the
times
lab
that are
system
used
and
in documents in the wild. I can't imagine that they were actually doing
Right.
ambulatory encounter times.
I mean, for a while we had ambulatory settings that just recorded the day. I mean, for a long time, just recorded it. It happened on this day, and then their immunizations happened that day. Some of them had timestamps. Some medications didn't have date high, date low. So
yeah, they have effective time low and effective time high.
right.
At the same exact time.
Exactly.
Not to the second.
And they're only doing it now because they have to fill in a blank, you know, in the
Right.
document or, you know, for the quality measure.
So is there any guidance, though, that you'd need to apply for, say, a discharge summary that, are you saying you would not apply an effective time high at the time of patient discharge, but rather would hold that open until all the information gathering is done with it? Is that what I'm hearing, or
I mean, I think it's two different use cases because if you're trying to figure out clinical decision support for the patient and you're going to use that data that's captured, you're not going to wait for the doctor to sign off on the chart to do clinical decision support. You're not going to wait for, if you're using that for quality, you know, you're going to send that data immediately so you can review your quality and see where you stand. So, I mean, I feel like it needs a completion, clinical time completion of some sort, but I don't know if encounter is the right word.
Right. Well, it's not the word that I'm saying so much as the if you express that encounter in an encounter summary document, like a discharge summary, progress note, or something, is how would you indicate the conclusion of that encounter? or when you indicate the end time of that encounter in effective time, is that supposed to reflect like a discharge from a hospital, or is it supposed to reflect the conclusion of the information gathering? That was my question.
I think in a hospital environment, the discharge is a more definitive point that rather than a patient checking out from, you know, an office visit.
Yeah, certainly that makes sense. Okay.
And you can't measure in and out time because there's a lot of wait time in there.
Right.
This is Matt from DHIT. I'm happy you brought that up, Linda, because I was at a clinic, I think it was a cardiology clinic, and they ended up manually tracking that time from the time the patient arrived to the wait time to the actual time you took for the encounter itself, literally that time in minutes. It was done via paper. And the problem ended up being is that, well, the good thing is that they had the data that they wanted, but then the problem ended up being that they had to digitize it. They couldn't truly act on it because it was still in paper form. And then it really got in the way of workflows for the MAs because it was a document that traveled. So it started with the front desk handed it to the MA, and the MA filled it out, and then it went to a PAL. And that PAL then needed to be processed by the end of the week because it was all paper. And you know, you assign one person.
Sounds like you had a manager left over from the 80s. To do that back then.
Well, they had a specific reason for tracking it. They wanted to track it for a particular reason because the EHR they had didn't account for it, but they wanted to know those kind of specifics you guys are mentioning now. But it in the end it fell through because it had good intention, but it just wasn't digital enough, and it just got left there.
Yeah, and Jessica can probably chime in here from our team. There's a clinical quality measure that ECQM that's very specific from transition of a patient from the ER department to the inpatient setting and the timestamp there. And when you start talking about encounters and those timestamps, every hospital has a different concept of that transition. Some use the transition message that the AO4 message to, not AO4, whatever it is, to transition. You know, and there's a big gap there, and that quality measure gets way out of whack because it's just not recorded the way the measure is written. So, I mean, it's a problem across the industry, I think, not just in CCD.
Yeah. Well, I would say that using these times to do any like fine-grained tracking of time for metrics it wasn't the use case that we were thinking about. You know, we were starting from the perspective of when's an encounter done. So I don't want to go into that, I don't think. I would say that maybe the way that we wrap this up is we would say, well, we don't have any additional guidance that we could offer on that when it's done to answer that mail. I did want to bring one thing up.
Maybe we need ONC to decide, Joe. It sounds like nobody agrees, and when nobody agrees, then it could get escalated that somebody who's in a position higher up to say, in order for our quality measures to make sense and for this data to be apples to apples, we need to decide that there is a data element called encounter over or something like that. Encounter done, it's a real thing, and we're going to define when that is, and then everybody has to do it the same.
Well, that's if there's a need for everybody to do it the same, because as I heard, the example of waiting for all the payment stuff to settle down and claiming it's done, that's a done for a certain audience. But I think the original question from the physician when we were in the work group was, I want to know when I'm not going to be waiting for an updated version of this encounter summary. And that's a very different question. Right? It
seems like that would be more about when the diagnosis is issued or when you actually have an assessment that's been done or something else in the document besides the timestamp. You know, you need very specific data elements to say, I'm at XYZ and therefore I'm releasing this document. And it's probably going to be different per hospital system or per EP environment, but I do think that, you know, if you don't have a plan of treatment or you don't have specific data, do you have enough to go on to even treat the patient moving forward?
That I think is key. I think that's exactly what we're after. If there's guidance that we could give, because even if it were only to be used in user interfaces by indicating to a viewer that, hey, this is probably settled down, it might be useful. It might answer this question. What I came up with, because the example we were talking about was outstanding lab results, that since we have in the guide in another place that if you have labs that were performed during the encounter, you would put them in the results. If they're not back yet, you would show those as pending. And so one measure of whether it's done is whether you still have pending results. That would tell you whether or not to expect a future encounter summary version that's new. Another one would be, as you said, is there a diagnosis? It would be great if we could just give that as a little bulleted list and say, we can't give a conclusive when you're done, but if you've got this and you've got no pending results and you've got this, then you're probably done. But of course, it could be corrected later. That would be probably better than a mistake.
It
you're not
maybe
done.
is the opposite of what, like you said before.
Yeah. Okay. I think this is promising, and we're going to be picking this work up in another work group. So this is promising fodder, I think, for further discussions. Thank you.
What work group is that?
Dee Dee, you want to tell them about that? Are you on? Are you on mute? All right. Well, I could tell you, it's been announced. It's there's a new Sequoia data usability work group that will be convening starting in a week or two, and it is in general is going to be picking up the work that this Commonwealth Care Quality group did and carrying it to the next phase.
Nice.
And I'll be facilitating this group as well. So please do participate.
How do they do that, Joe?
Is it a HL7 calendar or is it Sequoia?
No, it's on Sequoia.
Okay.
If Dee Dee's on, or if anybody's on who has the link to the Sequoia announcement page, you do it. Otherwise, I'll do it.
I'll try to go grab it right now. Joe,
Okay.
I know I got the email a couple weeks ago.
Great, appreciate it. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next one, to the next topic. Generating current patient summaries. Let me just do a quick time check. Okay, so really I've got 5 minutes to talk about this unless I run to the end of the time frame. Thanks, John. All right, so so the guide has a requirement, kind of a holistic requirement, that if you want to view the patient, each system should produce an encounter document for each encounter and a patient summary, a current patient summary. But that wasn't sufficiently defined, and so we added a lot of content in section 4 of what does it mean to generate a current patient summary, and because it gets tricky when you ask for a patient summary and your query includes no date information, it's not date bound, then you could generate a patient summary with things like 30 days of vitals and every allergy and every immunization and 12 months of problems, but it's kind of left up to the responding system. And we tried to go a little further in that and see, well, how far could we go? And the short answer is we didn't get any further because we ran out of time, because lab interoperability took the remainder of our time. But what we did is after the work group had concluded, I fleshed out section 4 with information that we had gotten from the Veterans Administration on how they do this. And really, it's two main things. We talked about, thanks, Dee Dee. We talked about what a current patient summary means when you ask for it with no date preferences, and what it means if it's being queried for with a date range. And so we'll talk about what this is, and I'm going to jump ahead of this. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, I'd like to talk about this slide, but I've got to skip it. So here are the requirements that we have in the guide. If you get a non-time constrained query for a patient summary, which is a CCD, so that would mean any query that would resolve to a CCD, then you're generating a patient summary that's got active problems, meds, allergies, and immunizations. So whatever's active. And then also ensure the entries match the information from the most recent encounter. And that's it. As far as shalls, that's as far as we got, which is good. But just for example, here's what the VA does. They include all of the allergies, immunizations, and problems. They include the last 15 months of outpatient meds and all the meds from non-VA facilities. They include all the outpatient encounters, 5 most recent surgical procedures. So you can see, you know, there's a lot of heuristics that they've applied here. And the question that I have is this good enough? Is it good enough that all we do is say, have at it, there's no restrictions other than the active PAMI? And here's an example. Or are there any of these things that we feel strongly enough should be, and when I say we, it may not be structured documents feels strongly enough. It may be that structured documents wouldn't be the appropriate place. It may be that Commonwealth feels that, well, you always need all the encounters for however long. So consider that there are different governing groups that might have an opinion on this. My question to you is there anything structured docs would like to say about this?
How do you know what they included?
Well, there is another part of the guide that suggests that you always include the section time range, which would tell you the business rules. So for this example, you would expect the meds section to include a time range and some text that explains how this was calculated.
Can you talk a little more about that when you say the med section? Are you talking about the effective time in the section at the section level?
Not just the effective time, I'm talking about the extra entry, the section time entry from the companion guide.
It's a new template, Linda, that was introduced in the companion guide.
This.
And
yeah.
The requirements that this joint content work group have state that in all cases, the section time range template should be used for every single section. And Joe, one of the concerns I have about this is, why would this be relevant for an encounter summary? Why wouldn't this only apply to CCDs?
Oh, because we're talking about CCDs.
I think the language is in your the first introduction area where it talks about this. It says that this section, the recommendation is for the section time range to be used. It says in all cases, and it's not just specific to CCDs.
Yeah, you're right. I'm going to let Brett talk to that. But let's see.
And it's also not calculated based on the dates of the elements that are in that section. It's really driven by business rules to determine what goes into that section.
Right.
That was, when we first read this, the first thing the developer said to me, well, I'm just going to look at the first med and calculate the load time and go look at the last med and calculate the high time, and that would be the section time range. But after many emails with Brett about this, it was determined that it wasn't calculated off the time element on the templates, and it was actually calculated based on business rules in the application.
Right. So
what about the ones that are not time-based? Like one of yours said up to 5 procedures in the last 18 months. What if they had 20 in the last 18 months? How would the user know?
Yeah, well, let's look at the companion guide and what it has to say about this. This just describes the observation entry to describe the business rule. It references the human readable information disclosing the applied business rules in the narrative text of the section. So I'd like to see more guidance on how to use this. In fact, we, like here's an example, procedures performed between this. In the case where it's something like the last 5 years not to exceed 25 entries, I think that should be, we should have strong requirements to require you to put that in the text, right? Because it's not just an entry with a low and a high, right?
And especially when you start to think about parity with fire resources.
Right.
If the client runs a query on procedures for that same time range and gets back something different than the C-CDA, they're not going to be happy.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So, but getting back to our.
Can you hear me, Joe?
Now I
Brett.
can. Yes. Oh, were you on mute before?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so Linda, your comment is exactly where this observation came from. Is folks were querying for sets of information, and then arbitrary restrictions were being applied, and the receiver would have no idea what was applied. And I think Joe's comment about, the last 25 versus the date range, it's really a separate kind of almost observation to say I'm returning the last 10. Right now, it really is a time range. And, if folks made a case that they wanted to do the last 10, there is that capability in Fire that we added, that we could add that type of thing here. I know it's been discussed, but I did bring it up here one time before, and there was some interest, but not enough to add another observation, or maybe even enhance the existing section time range observation.
Well, the one that it comes up with a lot, and I think John can jump in here too, is vital signs. You can have so many vital signs; they make no sense.
Yeah.
After a while, right?
Well, and a lot, some generators originally, I don't know if they've changed it since for it, but originally, 5+ years ago, I thought actually took a very reasonable approach, which is send the last 3 regardless of the time range, which is, here's your last 3 weights. It could be from last week, it could be from last year, it could be from a decade ago, but the last 3 vital signs they thought was going to be useful and not overwhelming for it. I mean, there's also a lot of kind of feedback collected, I guess, part of pertinent and relevant regarding some of this stuff too, but
yeah.
Yeah, no, but I mean,
it's like we need another thing in another template to represent that concept.
I would,
or additional work in the same. Yeah.
I mean, if you said these are the vital signs from the last week, and you timestamp them to say, and you're only 3 present, is it helpful to then know that the site only sent you 3? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I can think of some place where it'd be very useful, but I would think that the time range, well, I'm going to make an inference that the time range is more important because we did that one first, and that was the one that was asked for. But I could see the case for the other one also.
Yeah.
Well, and think about as you start adding things like Fitbit stuff that are, device stuff that gets recorded, and you can have literally hundreds of those recordings in a short period of time, probably more.
Well, I think that you're not disagreeing with each other. I think that the fact that the section time range template includes both a processable time range and a human readable text entry, I think that should cover your cases. What I think is maybe the only missing thing is that it would be useful to have guidance for these kinds of special cases of.
But Joe, I don't think it does cover the case. Like the one you had where you had the last 5 in the last 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
If you said 18 months here between blah and blah, you know, you may get less than that.
So that's
So,
no. So the second
yeah,
time
I
range
get
is
it.
supposed to reflect what you actually range you applied. So if you only filtered the last 5, that
Got
second
it.
time range I wouldn't expect to be before that furthest 5th one you pick.
So,
Sorry,
so
everyone.
Brett, my question for you, Brett, is looking at this example, if it was last, like the last 5 from the last 18 months, would you put 18 months as the
No.
at the low high?
No,
and
no,
last 5.
no.
Okay. All right.
Feel
So
like
you would
Put the earliest
Sorry,
procedure
everyone,
that you're
I'm gonna
including.
need to-
the earliest
to
one.
cut in. We're past time. We've got to allow people to have a break. Our next session
Okay.
is coming up.
Okay.
Sorry. Thanks, Joe.
I,
Thanks.
I think this really needs more explanation, Brett, based on just like the two of you
Lisa, you
going
cut-
back
cut
and
me
forth
off.
right there.
Lisa, sorry, you cut me off. I agree. We need more time on this. We are past time for this part of the session, so we're gonna have to take this up in another call somewhere or something.
Yes, I'm agreeing. I'm agreeing, John. I just feel like that's what we should write down, that the action is to take this up to get more guidance down the road.
Right.
Maybe examples task force.
All right. So our next session's in 7 minutes. Lisa, do you need the whole time? Can we give everyone a little bit of a bigger break?